Well, we want to now get into an interesting report that has been released by Deloitte that shows the trends when it comes to construction in Africa. And we want to speak to Dr. Mark Smith, who is a capital projects partner at Deloitte, to help us make sense of what this report does mean and what are some of the implications that we are likely to see when it comes to implementation. Good afternoon. Always a pleasure to have you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for coming on board. And let's get into this matter of the report that was released. Just bring us up to speed on some of the key highlights of this report.
Well, so this is our Deloitte's annual report that's looking at what's happening in the infrastructure investment marketplace within the entire continent of Africa, but specifically within East Africa. And what we've come through is a number of trends that we're seeing that the investment appetite and what's really happening is very, very positive. We've actually had, if you look at the continent of Africa, a $500 million increase to almost $300 billion worth of work going on now within Africa. And then if you look at East Africa, we have a very, very sizable amount of investment going on, close to $60 billion being invested in infrastructure within East Africa.
Mm-hmm. One of the key issues that has emerged over time is that Africa continues to face a huge infrastructure deficit that has sort of made the continent not competitive. And to be precise, Kenya is trying to develop some key projects that could make the country become more competitive. And from where you sit, are we on the right track when it comes to execution of these projects according to the report?
Well, according to our analysis, what we're finding is within East Africa and specifically within Kenya, we're finding that over 80% of the investment is going into what I call basic infrastructure. So it's around energy needs and transport, whether that might be rail, road. And so that is really what's driving a lot of the investment. So I do think that is on the right track, because any kind of economic growth has to be pinned to the infrastructure development that's going on currently and also going for the next decade.
Mm-hmm. The other interesting development around infrastructure is that we are seeing a number of countries actually coming on board when it comes to financing these projects. From where you sit, where does this place Kenya, looking at some of the big boys who are trying to get an entry into Africa and they're trying to fund different projects? What sort of projects are investors looking out for when it comes to investing in Africa in infrastructure?
So I think our analysis, what we're showing is that, again, 2/3 of the investment is still coming from the big donor funds and the DFIs. So that's driving a lot of the funds coming in for the basic infrastructure. With that said, we're still seeing the Chinese companies, being very, very actively involved here within Kenya, but also throughout the East Africa region. Especially notable, Ethiopia is another country that the Chinese are investing heavily in. Mm-hmm. So again, we're seeing, but we're also seeing a lot of interest coming from the large international players in Europe and America. So the interest is definitely rising in terms of the analysis that we've been doing.
Of course, Kenya the other day did come up with a piece of legislation that factors in private-public partnerships, the PPI unit under Treasury. From your analysis, how effective has this unit been? Because you're seeing a number of PPP projects that are yet to take off, and what is the downside of this?
So Deloitte's very active in this marketplace, and in fact working closely with the PPP unit here in Kenya. And what we're seeing on that is actually, from our analysis, is about 3 years ago, we had less than 3% of the programs being funded through public-private partnerships. And today, what we see is actually a triple-fold increase. So we have almost 15% of the programs now using a PPP structuring. And some of the large infrastructure programs, whether it's a new bridge in Mombasa to the road network that's going from Mombasa to Nairobi, this is all going to be funded through the PPP structuring. And so again, we see from foreign investors that quite interested in terms of this vehicle to help finance some of the shortfall that we have within the basic infrastructure here in the country.
Speaking about the shortfall, what's Kenya's shortfall at the moment?
Well, right now we're looking infrastructure investment is really a decade-long cycle, because if you look at a lot of these programs, whether it's the standard gauge railway, whether it's the transport, the airport structure, the development of the Lapsset corridor up through Kenya and into Ethiopia and South Sudan, this is a decade-long infrastructure program. So again, we're at the beginning stages of a lot of the basic infrastructure now that, the significant investments going in. And I think over the next 3 to 5 years, this is where you're going to start seeing the difference really happening, is over that time period.
And as we wrap up the interview, what is your outlook moving into the future now that we're seeing some concerted efforts coming in from different governments across Africa, where we're seeing heads of state trying to put their heads together and say, we want to work together on these projects? What should we expect into the future, really?
So I think what we are seeing in terms of what drives the economic growth is not country by country decision making, but inter-country decision making, especially around these regional transport corridors and a lot of the infrastructure development that's happening. So we see that as a very, very exciting thing that's happening, and something that a lot of the international investors are looking for. They want to see the inter-regional trade, because that's what's going to drive investment as well as economic growth, I think, for the country, as long as we're continuing along this path around the inter-regional development and the execution that's happening amongst the heads of the state.
Perfect place to end the conversation.
Good. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a pleasure speaking to you, Dr. Mark Smith, who works with Deloitte, and he's in charge of capital projects.